I would just, I think, like to start with Olivier, and to give us a sense, if you would, of what moneyball for government might mean in the context of your firm, and in particular how you marry social objectives with the needs of satisfying shareholders of a listed company.
Yeah. Well, I don't know about Moneyball and the whole thing about statistic and smart data to achieve better outcomes, as I understand it was the case with this baseball team. But I can tell you that in John Lang, we've invested in public-private partnership for the last 30 years. We've done more than 140 projects. We do believe that private investment can have a social impact on the life of communities. And we also believe that governments can get more out of the private sector and private investment to improve the delivery of public services. And I've got a couple of examples
Please.
that I'm sure are unusual to the audience. For instance, we've invested, designed, built, and now operate a prison in New Zealand, whereby the objective was not to build a prison, it was to reduce reoffending. Hey, private sector, would you put, please, $1 billion, Kiwi dollars, on the table to design, build, and manage this prison to reduce reoffending by 10%? We did it, and it works. And I can tell you that it's counterintuitive to an investment committee, a board, or markets, but I realize that we can really reduce reoffending with private money, private investment, private services, and clear targets and guidance from the public sector. So we believe we can have a social impact on communities while delivering market rate returns. And this is very important. We are not in reduced returns. We are in delivering, because we're a listed company, we have to deliver market rate returns, but we do that on the back of increased responsibilities and risks on public services.
How did that come about? Was it the New Zealand government tendered on that basis, or that was you coming with the idea?
No, on this one, credit to the Department of Corrections in New Zealand. You see, public-private partnerships, people believe that it's something invented in the last 20 years, whereas it was invented during the Industrial Revolution in Europe and the United States. I think that governments now, some of them, try to say, there is a huge amount of money that wants to go into infrastructure. Can we go the extra mile and ask more from the private sector? It's valid for corrections. It's valid from roads. For roads, I could give you the example of a great tender whereby we had to build a road to reduce death and serious injuries from accidents. How do you design the road? I mean, we're used to designing and building roads on the cheap, or with engineering achievements, not to reduce accidents, but it works.
Where was this?
That was in New Zealand as well. But I've got examples elsewhere in the world, in the UK, for instance,
where bumps or speed bumps every
it's about information about hazards and weather. It's about helping the police to target speeding offenders. It's about big data to see how people drive on the road, what creates accidents, but it works. And we can take the risk, and if we deliver on the targets, we make a return.
What's the conversation that you have with your shareholders and investors around that? I mean, you're taking on things which are firstly new and potentially difficult for you to control in terms of outcomes. So how difficult was that?
So we're saying a few things. This is a key question because, again, it's not obvious for shareholders to say, really, we've put our money on the back of reducing reoffending in a prison in Auckland, bearing in mind that we're listed in London. It takes a bit of education and explaining. Having said that, these investors years ago used to invest into toll roads, build a road and pay you back on revenues. I mean, private sector has no impact whatsoever on the number of cars on the road. So for me, that's a risk that is not worth taking, because if we get it wrong, we don't have any option. We're stuck. We've done it once, lost our money, we won't do it again. Whereas when it comes to improving the delivery of public services, at least we can try to understand what the problem is. If we have an impact, can we team up with operators around the world that, non-profit or for-profit organizations that are doing it? and put a consortium together with banks, builders, service companies in order to deliver the service. So with investors, we try to explain to them that, one, we try to understand what is required from us, and if we believe we've got a solution, then we will invest to solve the problem, and eventually we'll make a return. And I have to say, at the end of the day, as you know, there is so much money today in the world that is desperate to get into new projects that, I think if there is a time for private investors to take a bit more risks, it is now.
Tracy, how do you reflect on this? Because a lot of it sounds very familiar. It's the sort of language of social impact bonds and pay for success generally, but potentially a kind of very fast route to getting to those aims without some of the frictions that we know exist with social impact bonds.
It's so interesting, Andrew, and thank you for having me here. The conversation is both familiar and unfamiliar. Maybe the Kiwis are far more creative and enlightened than the Americans in terms of doing business. In our economy, there's a thriving taxable and tax-exempt market around municipal finance, for example, to pursue these projects, whether it's building a facility to house prisoners or a bridge or a toll road. And that is quite distinctly different in a kind of full bifurcation way than how our states and cities and our federal government fund social services. And to hear Olivier talk about a project that can combine both aims is actually not how we do business in America. In fact, the very underlying principle that is driving the thinking behind pay for success, which is the nomenclature in this country, social impact bonds, which is what we inherited from our sister organization in the UK that pioneered the world's first social impact bond in 2010, that impetus with that is actually to create a financial market to invest in our social infrastructure, just like we have a thriving mainstream financial market to invest in our physical infrastructure. And what does it mean to create these new public-private partnerships, to bring very uncommon partners to the table, at least in the American sense of the word, around a common purpose? And in this case, in our experience in working in the States now, we're 6 years old in the United States, 15 projects nationally in the United States covering a wide variety of social issues, is to bring these three very uncommon stakeholders, right? Private investors, which has been the topic of today, and two other stakeholders which have not really been talked about much today because the conversation has been very much about listed companies and mission-driven businesses. But we're introducing two more stakeholders in this trifecta, which is traditional nonprofit service providers, the people who touch our most vulnerable populations in our society, and the public sector. And it's bringing these three stakeholders into an arrangement to deliver both financial value and social value by focusing all the parties around solving some of the most intractable and persistent social challenges, whether it's the, 600,000 people who leave prison every year, and 400,000 of them actually return into the system, which costs this country $80 billion at the federal, state, and local level, or the 500 kids that get removed from their birth parents to be put in a congregate home or foster family that generates $25 billion as a nation to deal with this problem, or the lack of high-quality pre-K for 3- and 4-year-olds in our country. By the way, only 5% of this country's 3-year-old get publicly funded pre-K slots, and only 20% of 4-year-olds get that benefit. And it's a very, very different kind of impact investment opportunity because we're trying to serve the most vulnerable people in our country, and it's through making their lives better that we can provide a financial return back to our investors. So that linkage between, that flourishment of human potential, someone getting a job, someone getting the education that they need or the health outcomes that they deserve, is the very source of return back to the investors. And why? Because we construct these pay-for-success contracts, these new public-private partnerships that are multi-year in length, that basically obligates a state or local government to repay the investors who fronted these services, which are evidence-based. And it is through a fairly complicated negotiation exercise, because at the end of the day, pricing an outcome, right, is more of an art than a science. How do you price not only the savings to the fiscal system, but rather, more importantly, the intangible qualities of a life better lived and human potential, and net present value, all that stuff to the present day to price an outcome that government agrees to pay in the event of success, and investors agree to take on that risk to get compensated for success or lose their money upon failure. So, and I hope we'll get a chance to talk about why pay for success or social impact bonds isn't simply just an impact investment, but it's actually many other really exciting ideas, which I think in the 21st century is really it's no more timely moment to talk about tri-sector models. It's also about how we think about funding social services. How do we use evidence? How do we use data? How do we count things as a society that matters to all of us?
Okay, well, that's a very nice segue perhaps to Stacey, how this moneyball phrase, does pay for performance, social impact bonds, does this have the potential to sort of really change the way the government works, particularly in the US, where as Tracy laid out, there may be some roadblocks?
Yeah. Well, the beautiful thing about Moneyball, besides, Brad Pitt, was that it was not ex post, it was ex ante, right? So that you could you could look at data in a new way, look at data that wasn't looked at and wasn't well appreciated, and from that data, you can make predictions about who was going to be a good player and who was going to succeed when they were in their rookie year, and how would they look 10 years down the road. So I think that we're not there yet, and maybe it's that the phrase is not being correctly used, or maybe that there is some possibility for that kind of additional predictive quality to be laid on top of that. So that's one observation I would make. But on the international front, I think that I've been around international aid and development aid in developing countries all of my professional life, and any example, Tracy, that you could give on how public resources are badly spent, I could top that story by how international aid resources are badly spent. They have always been very politically driven, right? If you support the U.S. against the Soviet Union, we'll give you money. They've always been very flag planting. I used to work in Bolivia. There were 1,400 different donors doing education in Bolivia, very top down. We know what's best for the country, and and very input driven, right? If you check this box and you pass this law and you do this or that or the other thing, then we will disperse funds based on that. It's kind of like having a contractor, and you pay her, every time she puts a nail into a board, as opposed to actually if she's building you a house or not. And so that kind of aid paradigm has been a tremendous waste of resources, especially on the developing country side. Ministers of finance and development are completely overwhelmed by the international financial organizations and donors coming. There's no accountability to local constituents, because governments are kind of always trying to please funders and check boxes for funders. There's it fosters an aid dependency, and it undermines, local experimentation. And so the analogy to, look, we're all trying to, at the end of the day, we're all trying to kind of solve a principal agent problem, right? You want to know that that who you're contracting is doing a good job and is saving money, but you don't really know as much about that contractor as that contractor knows. So you have to set up your contract in such a way that you can align incentives. And in the international aid arena, you're always trying to figure out and monitor, is the government that you're giving money to committed in the same way to what you're trying to achieve, be it education reform or better health outcomes or whatever it is. And early sort of evolutions of better thinking in aid have been focused on things like better donor coordination and social impact development bonds, for example, which pay more based on outputs, sort of schools built, rather than checking to make sure that inputs are used in the right way. But now I think the cutting edge of development finance are things called cash on delivery aid. And I will, maybe in the next round, I'll talk more about the details of it, but just to kind of give you the punchline on it now, it's the idea that you pay for outcomes, for government outcomes. You reward government outcomes ex post. So you set up a kind of a pull mechanism that will incent governments that are already doing what you think that they should be doing. They're already grappling with these same problems, and you reward them for success. How they do it, though, you leave up to the governments. And there are, maybe when you come back to me, I'll give you some examples and extract some principles from that, or I can do that now. But
the providers of capital here, are they MDBs? Who are the provider of capitals?
Okay, so for example, unfortunately, there are not very many examples of this, but there are a couple of good ones and a couple of ones that you can kind of learn lessons from. So the very first example was from Gavi, and it was the Association for Vaccine Alliance. I think I might have that a little bit wrong, but what they did is they set a baseline for vaccination, and then they paid governments $20 for every child vaccinated on top of that baseline. So that was it, and they were a little bit more prescriptive about what the money could be used for. So when they paid the $20, you had to use it towards health outcomes. So Brazil had, and this was a Brazil developed idea, which was very important because then the Brazilian government could say, this is our idea, we were doing this anyway, and we found a donor to support what we wanted to do. It's very politically important, and it's also a very good signaling mechanism internationally for all kinds of other things. But they said, look, why don't we get paid for carbon sequestration? So how can we will do what we can do to reduce the amount of carbon that we emit because of better protection of the Amazon. And Norway said, oh, that is a great idea. And I think they gave $1.5 billion, allocated $1.5 billion to do this. So some of the principles about how this needs to work are, first of all, that it's, hands off on the part of the government, that they let the Brazilians, the Norwegians are letting the Brazilians do this however they deem best. That the outcomes have to be measurable and they have to be independently measured, but if not independently measured, at least independently verified. So in the Brazilian case, the Brazilian National Space Agency, that's not exactly the right word, but they take satellite and photographs of the Amazon. And so and they can measure on a 10-year rolling average. They take the average of the last 10 years, and every 5 years they move it forward 5 years, and they take these pictures and they calculate sort of the rate of deforestation. And for every bit of improvement in that, they pay out, I think it's $5 per ton that they calculate of carbon that the preservation of the rainforests have allowed. And the nice thing about that, right, is that it also has a sunset clause because if you're doing it right, the 10-year averages get better and better. So you're kind of raising the bar as time goes on to have this outcome. Another great example, and I can talk also about some examples that haven't worked so well or that you've learned lessons from. But another great example has been, and again, this is country-driven by India. So they are now funding with a World Bank loan. So how the money gets there is kind of independent of the outcome that you're trying to drive. So the government can borrow the money to get this and get paid back, or they might have money already that they're spending. But anyway, in India, the street defecation problem. And so now there's a World Bank loan, I think it's a $1.5 billion that they're giving, and the federal government of India is the recipient of that money, and they in turn devolve it out to the state governments, and the state governments determine on their own how best to solve this street defecation problem. And surveyors go around, and they survey these cities, and they measure year by year, and you're paid by improvements in that outcome, and nobody cares how you get there.
Okay,
So,
fantastic. Thank you. We might come back to some of the lessons, but Olivier, just to come back to your initial examples from New Zealand, sort of interested in how you insure against kind of unexpected outcomes. So prisoner rehabilitation, for example, if the New Zealand government, say, has an election and someone comes in with a different set of policies and decides to cut spending on prisoner rehabilitation, that potentially has the a direct impact on your outcomes. So how do you ensure against that? And then the other is replicability, right? I mean, one of the powerful things of Pace of Success is that it should be a way of seeing what works and then replicating it around the country. As a private enterprise, your interest may not be particularly aligned with that, right? I mean, if you found the secret source of prisoner rehabilitation, your incentive is to keep hold of it, isn't it?
Well, or to promote it. I mean, as an investor in infrastructure project, our big problem is not the lack of funding, but the lack of projects. Mm-hmm. So we're trying to encourage and give ideas to governments to give us more responsibilities, even if we have to take more risks. That's why we need to say, hey, we can do more, we can take more risks. Don't ask us just to build a road, ask us to reduce congestion. Don't ask us to build a prison, ask us to reduce reoffending. Now, once this is said and the project is out, obviously there is a very important point about the definition of the outcome and the pricing of the outcome. And of course, people forget that public-private partnerships are usually 30 years long contracts. And over the 30 years, governments may change or, Crossrail in London is just about to be finished. And someone told me recently that the whole project, which is the new underground line, has taken 7 prime ministers to build it and counting. So as you can see, the difficulty, the sophistication of our job is to put in a contract enough flexibility that will allow for changes. On a road, there will be driverless cars. Prisons, it's very interesting because this prison has been open for 18 months. It was designed mainly for one type of population, which was, let's say, violent. And now we've got drug dealers. And it's a completely different population to deal with. So the parties have to get together and find ways to stick to the objective while, retaining the incentives to all parties, public sector and private sector. Public-private partnerships are not carved in stone. They've been around for 150 years. They are living animals. And it's up to the lawyers, to the contractors, to the investors and governments to say, let's keep the principle of it and adapt so that we can take into account the evolution of life. But again, if the parties are smart and clear about the outcomes, we believe that we can find solutions. It's all about engaging. It's not just the contract. It's about how smart are the parties to achieve the outcome. But we can stick to the principle. We've got a vested interest in it because if we don't demonstrate to public authorities that we can contribute, we can solve a problem, our business is going to disappear. We're not builders. We are problem solvers. So it's up to us to provide solutions.
Tracy, just on the transaction costs around Pay for Success, which has been a sort of area of criticism that they take such a long time to design up front and they're necessarily difficult from that point of view. What's the sort of prognosis in terms of things becoming frictionless?
Yeah, it's such a great question. So people lump everything from the design, build, and operate, all that stuff into transaction costs or Pay for Success. In fact, if you just think about the financing component of any given social impact bond project, is actually fairly straightforward. You put everything into a contract, you raise the capital, whether it's a debt structure or an equity structure, and then you get your lawyers to draw up the PPM on the contract, and then it gets funded. That set of activities takes several months. What takes so long that leads up to the financing set of activities is actually all the work that goes into convincing a government that this is the right way to think about solving your problem, helping them think through what exactly is the social challenge that they would like to solve, articulating the target population they would like to help, creating a baseline of the cost of how much this is burdening the government today, thinking through all the benefits that could result from this project. All that activity, which is really in the designing a bridge piece, right, is all the work that precedes the financing piece. And that stuff is more about changing mindsets more than anything. The technical aspects of it is fairly straightforward, but bringing, public sector leaders together with nonprofit partners that operate in a very different frame, and then fitting all the realities of, public sector decision making into an investor framework, and having everything be memorialized in a contract, yes, a living document. That is the stuff that takes time. But I would also like to go back, if I may, Andrew, to Olivier's point about having these long-term contracts. One of the other criticism that we often get, in addition to large transaction costs, which people need to unpack, is that why doesn't government just directly fund these fantastic programs? The Economist would say, this is the second best solution to have to go through this complicated private financing when government could actually decide to invest in universal pre-K, and invest in workforce reentry for people leaving prison, et cetera, et cetera. And I think that what we're trying to do through Pay for Success and these multi-year contracting structures is to work around the barriers which often shackle our most well-intentioned public leaders, right? Our mayors and governors, and Deval here was one of the first people who embraced this tool in the United States. They have great intentions, but can they plan 5 years ahead? Does the appropriation cycle reward them to do so? By the way, every public sector leader knows that vaccines is cheaper than treating disease, and it's, job training is cheaper than incarceration. Yet the appropriation cycle, the political cycle, don't reward them to make these long-term investments. Like, my co-founder David Blood talked about long-termism this morning. Government, yes, they want to be long-term, but the budgeting cycle around these social services are not long-term. So can we create these new public-private partnerships to assign risks, assign incentives in ways that keeps all these stakeholders into, again, we get confused with all these, fancy language around financing, but at the end of the day, everyone wants to solve a problem, move the needle on some of these really intractable social challenges, and it's about aligning incentives over the long run.
Stacey, did you want to jump in? Or?
No, I think that, and an interesting thing about the cash on delivery aid, which the Center for Global Development is doing a lot. Nancy Birdsall and Bill Saudoff are doing a lot of work on this, so I do want to give a shout out to that. But I think one of the interesting things is, there's a couple of non-parallels in our two examples, and one is that you need to change hearts and minds, and this sort of outcomes-based international aid really is looking only for governments that are already doing what you kind of want them to do. So it's very much country-driven, and you only support those countries, and you only kind of fund the budget for those countries that are already doing this work. And I think the second thing is that your NGO needs upfront capital. So you're trying to solve a time issue with capital, where again here, you're only supporting things that the government is already devoting budgetary resources towards. You're just establishing a kind of a pull mechanism and shining some bright light on what the outcomes can be, so that, to kind of try to further encourage good behavior. So it's a little bit easier that way. And it's like Erica said, I don't know if you're in the room, said earlier this morning, about shareholder alignment, and companies should get the shareholders that they deserve, ideally. And this is the same kind of idea that governments, developing country governments, should get the donors that they deserve.
We have a question which has come through the app, and then I'll take questions from the floor. So maybe for Olivier, everything we're discussing, the questioner asks, assumes a level of integrity that many countries' governments lack. Do you agree with that? How does one get around it?
I'm not sure about the many countries, but clearly some countries lack the level of integrity. And it's a shame, because it's clearly the limitation of our action. We don't go there. And therefore, we can't apply solutions or investment and to the problems locally. So yes, corruption is clearly a limit to what we can do as private sector.
I'd kind of be interested in the idea of scale, because one of the reasons to be interested in Pay for Success is as well as making government more efficient is that you get providers who do well to do even better, right? I mean, they get rewarded and they build scale. Do we have evidence of that that happening? Is it too early to say? Who wants to jump in on that?
I'll start off with a statistic in the United States. The nonprofit sector has not scaled. So Bridgespan did a study, I think, counting the number of nonprofits since 1975, and counted the number of them that have reached 50 million in scale, which in the private sector is nothing. Guess how many since 1975 of nonprofits reached 50 million in scale?
A low number.
A low number, exactly. It's 140. So this idea of getting to scale is really challenging for our civil society partners. Why? Because what are their access to capital to grow their work? It's either philanthropy, or if you're lucky, land a government contract that pays you 50 cents on the dollar, right? The capital markets to fund these nonprofits is very broken. And one of the exciting aspects of social impact bonds is that if you are a nonprofit with a track record of solving problems, with an evidence base, with a great management team, you now see a very different pathway to get to scale through accessing the capital markets in addition to philanthropy. So we're very excited to see this kind of mechanism rewarding probably already fairly large and well-established NGOs. Another criticism we often get is that this is not a tool for the younger ideas, smaller organizations. And you know, if we can help a small fraction of the 1.5 million 501c3s in this country to get scale, by the way, that's like 1 out of every 200 of us Americans, there's a nonprofit. I think that would be something good for the sector.
Yeah, you know, I would just make the observation that paying for outcomes and bailing in the private sector are not the same thing. I mean, we're talking about the two things here on this panel, but they're separate concepts. And so there are many ways that governments can achieve scale by leveraging in private sector capital through PPPs of various types beyond paying for outcomes, right? So there's you know, first loss guarantees, there's credit wrappers, there's a number of things that government, the public sector can do, and that interested third parties can do to help the private sector mitigate risk and then leverage that kind of capital and get to a larger scale. You know, more, you know, in the developing country context, you know, more MEGA, less grants kind of thing.
We talk a little bit about the US. You made an observation, I think, right at the front, that some of the tax arrangements here perhaps made it difficult for pay for success to take off. Olivier, I might come to you on this. I mean, what's your experience of, you know, the New Zealanders are covered in glory. What about the US as a place for this to take off?
For us, as a kind of international investors in infrastructure, we believe that the US is the next frontier. And obviously, the country is, you know, at the eve of massive investment in new infrastructure driven by needs, maybe policy, but, you know, especially the needs that have been around for many years and we're aware of them. So there is a great opportunity to leverage what we can do, to go over and beyond just building stuff and go into improving the delivery of public services. The US, some states have started. I've got the example, for instance, in Texas, where there are a couple of projects around managed lanes. And these are fascinating because it's not about widening a road or it's not building a new road. It's about reducing congestion with a high level of customer or user satisfaction. And it works. You know, the partners managed to cut the commuting time by 30 minutes in the morning, 30 minutes in the afternoon, and the level of satisfaction is around 80%. And it's about to be replicated in other states. So my point is, there is going to be a lot of things done in terms of new capacity, social infrastructure, transport, and it's really the time to convince, or to rather to engage with local governments and say, let's go the extra mile and base the contracts on clear outcomes. We can help you because there are other examples around the world. Transfer more responsibilities to public sector in return for market rate returns. You were asking about scale. One of the great things about our business model, for what it's worth, is that because we deliver market-based returns, we've got access to a lot of money. Funding is not the issue in our sector. Lack of project is.
Can I ask a question? Sorry. One of the reasons, Tracy, to your point earlier, I think that PPPs in the United States have been lagging behind other areas in the world are that the very fact that we have such a well-functioning municipal bond market. So local, state governments, they can raise money on their own and they're not interested in investing assets. So how could you build this into local bond market? Are there other ways to build the same idea of paying for sort of success into that framework?
Yeah, I think it's a really interesting time to rethink all of this. I'm not a lawyer, but my general counsel tells me that you actually cannot raise municipal finance money to fund social programs, operating money, money that goes to Department of Children and Families to keep families together, money that goes towards combating substance use programs. Like that is what state and local government raise taxes to pay for those social services. Whereas, in the kind of real asset, real property category, you can actually raise these kinds of funds to finance projects with recourse. The interesting thing, I think, facing our country with the need and obviously the political interest and will to embark on a major infrastructure type of spending is to think very carefully and creatively to think about how we can kind of piggyback on that massive infrastructure spend movement to actually deliver social outcomes. Yeah. Can we make sure that these jobs have equitable and fair wages? Can we make sure that we have the skills component and make sure that workers are being trained, making sure that it's not just construction jobs, but maintenance and operations, which require 4-year degrees, building sustainable communities for low-income families to live around these projects when it's going to take 30 years to build these projects. So the social dimension and the social fabric that could augment these physical infrastructure projects is a massive opportunity for our country.
So last question to all of you is in making that case, whose voice is most powerful? Who would have the most impact in making the arguments that you've just made? Who's it up to?
For me, I would say, if I can, this is a tricky question, as you understand. That was not expected. I would say that what matters to us, infrastructure happens at state level, more so than federal level. What matters is the vision, the commitment of the local states, governors and their administrations. And it's really up to them, as Tracy said, to say, fine, over the next 20 years, there's going to be a lot of money invested in infrastructure. How can we make more of it than just building the bridge or the road or the hospital, and help local communities improve outcomes or quality of life of communities, and leverage the private sector and this appetite for risk and for investment into public services or public assets to its maximum. Again, the word today is awash with money, as we know. There is a kind of desperate chase for returns. The private sector can really do more and take more risks and responsibilities in order to have the benefit, the privilege almost, to invest into public infrastructure. I can tell you that it's not about inventing new things. The world is full of convincing examples. But the place for new infrastructure and investment over the next 10 years all over the world, by far, is going to be the United States. I believe this is a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity to go beyond physical assets and to go into improving quality of life.